This week and next, we'll be looking at Kant's dialectic, wherein Kant treats our capacity of reason. Kant's aim in his dialectic is to unmask transcendental illusion. Kant explains that transcendental illusion is the seeming extension of the categories of the understanding beyond the limits of our possible experience in application to things in themselves. Kant contends that transcendental illusion is natural and indeed unavoidable, yet his aim is to show that transcendental illusion is illegitimate and indeed empty. Now, transcendental illusion is unavoidable, according to Kant, because it derives from the very nature of reason. While the understanding for Kant was our capacity to make judgments, reason is our capacity to draw inferences. Judgments use concepts to organize the objects of our possible experience, while inferences use more general principles to organize judgments. This is why Kant calls reason our faculty of principles. Kant explains what this means by saying that through reason, the particular is cognized through the universal. So for example, in a judgment of the understanding, we would judge that apples are red, for example, by comparing various objects, the apples, given to us in our possible experience, and identifying some general characteristic that they all share. So in judgments of the understanding, first the object is given with its property, and then the universal concept is abstracted from the given object. And this yields the cognition that apples are red, or that this apple is red, for example. In inferences of reason, by contrast, we cognize something of a particular object, not by seeking some property of the object that it shares with others, but rather by finding some more general principle under which the object falls, and knowing something of the object by knowing something of that more general principle. So for example, if we want to know something about Socrates through reason, we don't compare Socrates with other similar objects. Instead, we identify some general principle or some general condition under which Socrates stands. For example, being mammal. So if we know that Socrates satisfies the condition of being mammal, and then we know that everything that's a mammal is warm-blooded, we can thereby know that Socrates is warm-blooded. The thought here is that being warm-blooded is not a property of Socrates's that we can read off of his appearance, like we can read off the color red from the apple. Rather, it's a feature of Socrates that we can know through a more universal concept, namely being mammal. So in this way, we cognize the particular, Socrates, through the universal, being mammal. Now, of course, we can know more about Socrates by finding a more general principle. Just as Socrates stands under the condition of being mammal, mammals stand under the condition of being alive. So if we know that all living things are mortal, we can thereby know that all mammals are mortal and that Socrates is mortal. Now, this example brings out reason's fundamental function for Kant. When a particular is given, reason attempts to find the entire series of conditions for that particular. Reason attempts to construct an entire hierarchy of concepts that serve as conditions of that particular. Kant puts this by saying, for everything that is given, reason seeks to represent not only its condition, but moreover, the unconditioned totality of the series of conditions for the particular. And this is where transcendental illusion arises. Reason treats the whole series of conditions for any particular as if it were itself an object of our possible knowledge. Kant thinks that reason treats the series of conditions for any particular as if it were a thing in itself. Indeed, Kant thinks we come to represent three things in themselves, by representing series of conditions as unconditioned totalities. Kant thinks whenever we have an appearance in inner sense, we seek more and more general conditions for that appearance in inner sense, until we eventually represent the soul as the unconditioned totality of the series of appearances in inner sense. Kant thinks that whenever we represent a particular of outer sense, reason comes to represent the world as a whole as the unconditioned totality of the conditions of that particular given in outer sense. And finally, Kant thinks that when we're given an object of our possible experience in general, reason comes to represent the unconditioned totality of the conditions of the possibility of this object as a single object that contains within it all of reality. And for Kant, this is our representation of God. Now again, Kant thinks it's inevitable that we form these ideas of the soul, the world as a whole, and of God, because these ideas arise through reason's own proper functioning, its search for a more general condition under which to subsume any given particular. But the reason these ideas are illegitimate, according to Kant, is that they represent something as an object of our possible cognition that cannot be given to us in our experience, right? Neither the soul, the world as a whole, or God can be given to us in our possible experience. What's given to us are all of the particulars in the series of our experience, but the entire series itself is never given to us as a whole. So for this reason, while our faculty of reason inevitably represents the entire series of conditions for any given particular, where it goes wrong and lapses into an illegitimate use is when it represents the series itself, as if it were an object of our possible knowledge. Now this week, we're going to focus on reason's idea of the world as a whole, which Kant treats in his chapter called The Antinomies. Kant's claim in this chapter is that when the categories are applied to the world as a whole, as if it were itself an object of our possible experience, reason becomes antithetical. That is, reason becomes able to prove contradictory theses. So we're going to look specifically at the first and the third antinomies. The first antinomy treats the world as a spatio-temporal whole, and the third antinomy treats the world as a causally determined whole. So let's look first at the first antinomy. If we assume that the world as a whole is a spatio-temporal object, then we'll inevitably ask whether the world is infinite in space and time, or whether the world has a first moment in time and an outer boundary in space. Now, the antinomy arises because Kant thinks that it can be proved both that the world does have a beginning in time and an outer spatial boundary, and also that the world cannot have a beginning in time or an outer spatial boundary. So Kant calls the claim that the world has a beginning in time and an outer spatial boundary the thesis, and the claim that the world has no beginning in time and no outer spatial boundary the antithesis. Kant's proof of the thesis is as follows. If the world had no beginning in time, then there would have to be infinitely many temporal states of the world before the present. But, Kant reasons, the present can't occur until all of the temporal states of the world before the present state have elapsed, right? It can't be now until all the past times have already passed. But it is now. We are currently at the present state of the world. Therefore, all the previous temporal states of the world must have already passed. And since infinitely many temporal states of the world cannot have already passed, there must be only finitely many prior temporal states of the world. And if there's only finitely many states of the world prior in time, the current state of the world, then there must be a beginning of the world in time. Kant thinks that the same sort of reasoning holds in the case of space. Regarding the antithesis now, Kant's argument that the world has no beginning in time and no outer boundary in space is as follows. Kant reasons that if the world had a beginning in time, then there would have to be an empty time before the beginning of the world in time. But Kant reasons that nothing can arise out of an empty time. In King Lear's phrase, nothing comes from nothing. So this is the contradiction. It seems that the world must have a beginning in time, since infinitely many temporal states of the world cannot have already elapsed, and yet the world can't have a beginning in time, since it's inconceivable for there to be a transition from one time to another, wherein the first time there was nothing, and in the second time there was a world. Turning now to the third antinomy, the thesis is that there is freedom in addition to natural causal necessity. And the antithesis is that there's no freedom, but only a natural causal necessity. The proof of the thesis that there is freedom is akin to the proof of the thesis in the first antinomy. It proceeds as follows. Kant reasons that if everything happened in accordance with the laws of nature, then any current event takes place. An infinite series of causes would have had to already taken place. The thought here is that a given event in nature can't occur until its proximate cause has already occurred and caused it to occur. But insofar as its proximate cause is itself an event in nature, it can't occur until its proximate cause has occurred, and so on. It would seem that an infinite series of causes would have already had to occur in order for a given event to occur now. But since events do occur now, and an infinite series of causes could never get finished, there must be only a finite series of natural causes. There must, therefore, be a first cause, an uncaused cause, that begins the series. And in this sense, there must be freedom in addition to natural necessity. As for Kant's proof of the antithesis, that there is no freedom, only natural necessity, Kant reasons that just as it's incoherent to suppose that the world arose out of nothing in time, it's equally incoherent to suppose that there's a free creation of the world. Kant's argument is that to create something is to bring something about from a previous state in accordance with a rule. Consider what's the difference between the world being created and the world coming about at random. The thought is that while a random occurrence would take place without reference to any rule, a creative act would have to be a rule-governed action. But, Kant argues, that to bring something about from a previous state in accordance with a rule just is causality. So for this reason, a creative act couldn't be a free act. Any creative act would have to be causally determined. So there can be no freedom, only causal necessitation. Again, this lands us in an antinomy. We've proven both that there must be a free act of creation at the beginning of the series of natural causes, since an infinite series of natural causes could never have taken place. And yet, it's incoherent to suppose that there's such a thing as a free creative act standing at the beginning of the series of natural causes. Now, Kant's contention is that these antinomies arise only because we've illegitimately treated the world as a whole as if it were itself an object. And Kant contends that the fact that antinomies arise from the assumption that the world itself is an object disproves that assumption. In this way, Kant claims that his antinomies constitute an indirect proof of transcendental idealism. Kant's thought here is that if transcendental realism were true, if the objects of our possible experience were things in themselves, then the totality of the objects of our possible experience would have to have a definite size in space and time, and it would have to have a definite causal history. In other words, the totality of the objects of our possible experience would either have to be infinite or finite in space and time. There would either have to be an infinitely long or an only finitely long causal history of the world. But since it can be proved both that the world does and does not have a beginning in time, and that the world both does and does not have a first cause, Kant thinks it follows that the objects of our possible experience cannot be things in themselves. Kant's transcendental idealism allows for the resolution of the antinomies, Kant argues, since if the world is merely a mind-dependent appearance, then it need not have definite size in space and time, and there need not be a definite causal history of the world. Instead, the world can be indefinitely large in space and time, and it can have an indefinitely long causal history. The thought is that for any given moment in time, or for any given event in time, we can always find a prior moment or a cause for that event. Indeed, it's rational for us to always search for a prior moment in time that conditions the given moment in time, or for an antecedent cause that conditions a given event. So in this way, reason's principle of seeking the condition for any particular is valid insofar as it regulates our research into nature. The principle becomes invalid, Kant contends, when it's used constitutively rather than being used regulatively in this way. Reason's principle is used constitutively when we assume that there's a mind-independent object that constitutes the series of the conditions for any given particular. So long as we assume that the series of conditions for any given particular is a mind-dependent series, we need not assume that the series itself has some determinate magnitude in space and time, or that the series itself has a cause. Now, what I'd like you to do in your papers is think more specifically about how it is transcendental idealism allows Kant to solve either the first or the third antinomy. In the case of the first antinomy, Kant thinks transcendental idealism shows us that both the thesis and the antithesis are false. It's false that the world has a beginning in time, but it's also false that the world is infinite in past time. Kant thinks these would be the only two options if transcendental realism were true, but that since transcendental idealism is true, a third option emerges. The world can have an indeterminate size in space and time. Regarding the third antinomy, Kant thinks that transcendental idealism allows us to see how both the thesis and the antithesis are true, though the thesis is true of things in themselves, and the antithesis is true of appearances. Kant's position here is that if appearances were things in themselves, we'd have an antinomy, since it would be the case both that there must be freedom and that there cannot be freedom. But Kant thinks that if we draw the transcendental distinction between appearances and things in themselves, we can say that there is freedom in the world of things in themselves, and that there is no freedom in the world of appearances. So if you want to write your paper on the third antinomy, you should figure out how this makes sense. How can a given event be the effect of a natural cause in the world of appearance, and also be the effect of freedom in the intelligible world? In Kant's explanation of this, he distinguishes what he calls our empirical character from our intelligible character. His thought here is that our empirical character consists in the set of psychological laws that govern our behavior. So Kant thinks that anything we do is the natural effect of our psychological state in accordance with psychological laws. Yet, Kant claims that our empirical character, this set of psychological laws, is itself the mere appearance, or the effect of, our intelligible character. Kant thinks that our intelligible character determines our empirical character, and that our intelligible character is an effect of our own freedom. So if you write your paper on the third antinomy, you should consider whether this attempted reconciliation of freedom and natural determinism makes any sense, and whether it's a satisfactory treatment of free will and determinism.